Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. The year is 1529. The world holds its breath. Suleiman the Magnificent, the shadow of God on earth, stands at the gates of Vienna. His empire stretches from the sands of Persia to the shores of the Adriatic. His armies are invincible. But here, before the rain-soaked walls of a city that refuses to yield, destiny hesitates. This is not just a siege. It is the collision of two worlds, the ultimate test of an emperor's ambition. This is the story of Suleiman's greatest gamble and his only true defeat. In the year 1520, a shadow fell across Europe, a shadow cast not by a storm cloud, but by a throne. In the opulent heart of Constantinople, within the labyrinthine walls of the Topkapi Palace, a new sultan ascended. He was only 26 years old, a young man of striking presence, known for his piercing eyes and a quiet, almost unnerving self-assurance. This was Suleiman, son of the fearsome Selim the Grim. To his people, he was Kanuni, the lawgiver. To the terrified courts of Europe, he was the Magnificent, but in his own mind he was something more profound. Zilullah-i fil alem, the shadow of God on earth. His destiny, he believed, was not merely to rule, but to expand the domain of the righteous, to bring the entire world under the banner of the one true faith. He inherited an empire forged in blood and conquest, an empire that had swallowed Byzantium whole and now stretched from the gates of Persia to the shores of the Adriatic. He inherited the world's most formidable army, the Janissaries, slave soldiers raised from childhood to know no loyalty but to him, the Sipahis, armored cavalry who thundered across the plains, and an artillery corps that could shatter the proudest stone walls of Christendom. But Suleiman was no mere warlord. He was a poet who wrote of love and mortality under the pen name Muhibi, a master goldsmith, a student of statecraft who understood that power flowed not just from the cannon's mouth, but from the quill of the bureaucrat and the scales of the judge. He saw himself as a new Solomon, a new Alexander, destined to unite East and West. His gaze, from the very beginning, was fixed westward. He saw a fractured Europe, a continent tearing itself apart with the new heresies of a German monk named Luther and the endless petty squabbles of its kings. He saw weakness, and where Suleiman saw weakness, he saw opportunity. The first tremors of his ambition were felt in Belgrade and Rhodes, fortresses deemed impregnable, which fell to his armies with shocking speed. Each victory was a confirmation of his divine mandate. Each conquered city was a stepping stone on a path that led inexorably towards the heart of his enemy, towards the great capitals of Christendom. The stage was being set for a clash of civilizations, orchestrated by a man who believed he was an instrument of God's will. Every great ruler, every shadow of God, needs a man who can navigate the darkness for him. For Suleiman, that man was not born of noble Ottoman blood, but was a Greek, snatched from his home as a boy, a product of the Devshirme system. His name was Ibrahim. He was Suleiman's falconer, his confidant, his brother in all but blood, and ultimately his grand vizier. The bond between them was legendary, a relationship of such profound intimacy that it defied all courtly protocol. They ate together, studied together, and dreamt of conquest together. Ibrahim of Parga was the architect of Suleiman's grand strategy, the whisper in the Sultan's ear that gave shape and direction to his imperial ambitions. While Suleiman was the embodiment of divine authority, Ibrahim was the master of earthly mechanics. He was a brilliant diplomat, a cunning strategist, and a man whose personal ambition was as boundless as the empire he served. He married the Sultan's own sister, a sign of unprecedented favor that elevated him to a status second only to the Sultan himself. It was Ibrahim who looked at the map of Europe and saw the critical fracture point: Hungary. The kingdom of Hungary was the bulwark of Christendom. the buffer state that stood between the Ottoman tide and the German heartlands of the Holy Roman Empire. Ibrahim understood that to break Europe, he must first break Hungary. He fed Suleiman reports of Hungarian weakness, of a boy king, Louis II, struggling to control his arrogant and rebellious nobles. He spoke of the insult from the Hungarian court, their refusal to pay tribute, and the mistreatment of Ottoman envoys. He framed the invasion not merely as a conquest, but as a just and necessary punishment. The decision to march north was not a spontaneous act of aggression. It was a calculated move in a grand chess game, conceived in the quiet chambers of the palace, born from the intimate conversations between the Sultan and his Grand Vizier. Ibrahim's rise was a testament to the Ottoman meritocracy, but it also contained the seeds of tragedy. His influence was so immense, his power so absolute, that he began to see himself as the true orchestrator of the empire's fate. For now, however, his vision and Suleiman's were perfectly aligned. The great war machine of the empire was set in motion, its destination decided by the Grand Vizier's whisper. The summer of 1526 saw the greatest army in the world on the march. 100,000 men and 300 cannons moved with terrifying discipline across the Danube plains. This was the Ottoman fist, and it was aimed directly at the heart of Hungary. Opposing them was King Louis II, a young man of 20 leading an army crippled by arrogance and internal division. The Hungarian nobles, proud and brave, fatally underestimated their foe. They chose their ground near the town of Mohacs, an open, sodden plain that offered no tactical advantage. They placed their faith in the heavy cavalry charge, a tactic that had dominated European battlefields for centuries, but was about to meet its terrifying obsolescence. On August 29th, under a sweltering sun, the battle was joined. The Hungarian knights, a magnificent spectacle in their polished plate armor, charged with reckless courage directly into the Ottoman center. For a moment, it seemed to work. They smashed through the front lines of irregular troops, but it was a trap. They were being funneled into a killing ground. As the Hungarians surged forward, the Ottoman flanks closed in, and the heart of their line parted like a curtain, revealing the true face of the Sultan's army, the massed ranks of janissaries, armed with muskets, and the terrifying maws of 300 cannons. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The cannons fired chain-shot at point-blank range, scything through men and horses. The janissaries unleashed disciplined volleys of musket fire that shredded the lines of knights. The charge faltered, dissolved into chaos, and became a rout. In less than 2 hours, the flower of Hungarian nobility was annihilated. 20,000 were killed on the field. King Louis II, fleeing the carnage, was thrown from his horse into a muddy stream and, weighed down by his own armor, drowned. The kingdom of Hungary effectively died with him. In the days that followed, Suleiman, seated on a golden throne, watched as his men executed thousands of prisoners. The field of Mohacs, littered with the dead, was said to be so covered in bodies that it looked like a field of black crows from a distance. The path to the Hungarian capital, Buda, was open, and beyond Buda, a greater prize glittered in the distance: Vienna, the gateway to Germany. The fall of Hungary sent a shockwave of terror through Christendom, but the conflict was about to escalate onto a truly global stage. This was no longer simply an Ottoman war against a minor kingdom. This was now a direct confrontation between the two most powerful men on the planet. In Constantinople, Sultan Suleiman I, Caliph of Islam, Master of the East. In Vienna and Madrid, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Archduke of Austria, Lord of the Netherlands, and ruler of a burgeoning empire in the New World. Their dominions spanned the globe, and their rivalry was both deeply personal and ideological. Each saw himself as the rightful ruler of the world, the true defender of his faith, and the other as a tyrant and an infidel. They were the two poles of 16th-century power, and their struggle would define the age. Charles V was a formidable opponent, but his power was stretched to its breaking point. His vast empire was a tapestry of disparate peoples and competing interests, almost impossible to govern effectively. While Suleiman commanded an absolute, centralized authority, Charles was constantly battling his own vassals, the French king Francis I, and the rising tide of the Protestant Reformation. The German monk, Martin Luther, had shattered the religious unity of Charles's empire, creating a deep and bitter internal conflict that consumed his attention and his resources. For Charles, the Ottoman threat in the East was just one of many fronts in a relentless multidimensional war. He had to contend with French invasions in Italy, Protestant princes in Germany, and the immense logistical challenge of moving troops across his sprawling territories. Suleiman and his Grand Vizier Ibrahim watched this with keen interest. They understood that Charles's distraction was their greatest strategic advantage. They supported his enemies, funded Protestant princes, and allied with the French against their common Habsburg foe. The destruction of Hungary at Mohacs was a calculated blow aimed directly at Charles's family holdings, as the now vacant throne of Hungary was claimed by his brother, Ferdinand of Austria. The stage was no longer a regional battleground, it was the world. Every move Suleiman made in the Balkans was felt in Madrid. Every decree Charles signed in Germany had repercussions in Constantinople. The march on Vienna was, therefore, not just an invasion, it was a personal challenge, a gauntlet thrown down by one emperor to another. In the grand tapestry of Ottoman ambition, there was a legend, a prophecy, a burning desire known as the Kızıl Elma, the red apple. It was not a fruit, but a city, a symbol of ultimate conquest. For generations of sultans, its location shifted, from Constantinople to Rome. But for Suleiman, in the high summer of his power, the red apple had a new name, Vienna. It was the heart of his great rival, the Habsburg dominion, the personal seat of Ferdinand I and the gateway to the German lands of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. To take Vienna was not merely to conquer a city, it was to plunge a dagger into the heart of Christendom and to claim undisputed mastery over Europe. Suleiman, the lawgiver, the Magnificent, saw the world as a stage for two great actors, himself and Charles. All other kings were minor players. He had shattered the Hungarians at Mohacs, turning their kingdom into a vassal state. He had proven his might on land and was building a navy to challenge the seas. But the Habsburgs remained a thorn in his side, a challenge to his universal claim. Vienna was the key. It stood as a bulwark, a defiant fortress on the Danube that blocked his path to the rich heartlands of Europe. Taking it would be the ultimate act of power, a humiliation of the Habsburgs from which they might never recover. The campaign was framed not just in strategic terms, but in cosmic ones. It was the destiny of the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth, to carry the banner of Islam to the farthest corners of the world. The whispers in the Topkapi Palace were not of if, but when. The court poets wrote of the Sultan's inevitable triumph, of the day the call to prayer would echo from the spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral. For Suleiman, this was more than a war. It was the fulfillment of a legacy, the final, decisive move in a grand chess match for the world. Vienna was the prize, the golden, gleaming apple waiting to be plucked. When Suleiman moved, the earth itself seemed to tremble. The army he assembled in the spring of 1529 was not merely an army, it was a migration of power, a mobile city of steel and sinew. From every corner of his vast empire the soldiers gathered. The numbers alone were enough to inspire terror across Europe. Estimates speak of over 100,000 fighting men, accompanied by a support contingent that may have doubled that figure. At its core were the Janissaries, the slave soldiers raised from childhood to know nothing but war and loyalty to the Sultan. They were the world's first modern standing army, disciplined, fearless, and armed with state-of-the-art matchlock muskets. They marched in eerie silence, their tread a drumbeat of impending doom. Thundering alongside them were the Sipahis, the feudal heavy cavalry, clad in shimmering mail and plate, their lances a forest of deadly points, And then came the irregulars, the wild Akinci light cavalry, the raiders who were unleashed ahead of the main force to sow chaos and terror, to burn, to pillage, and to break the enemy's will before the first battle was even fought. But the true symbol of Ottoman might was its artillery train. Cannons of monstrous size, some requiring dozens of oxen to pull, were dragged from the imperial foundry in Constantinople. This was the science of siege warfare perfected. This was the force that had breached the unbreakable walls of Constantinople, of Rhodes, of Belgrade. Accompanying this river of soldiers was a staggering logistical tale. Thousands of camels carrying supplies, blacksmiths, armorers, engineers, and surgeons. To the terrified peasants of the Balkans and Hungary, this was not a human force. It was a divine scourge, an apocalyptic host sent to punish a sinful world. It moved with the inexorable force of a glacier, a living embodiment of the Sultan's absolute and terrifying power. The Sultan could command 100,000 men. He could forge cannons that spat fire and stone. He could make kings tremble with a single word, but he could not command the clouds. The spring of 1529 was not a season of conquest. It was a season of unending rain. From the moment the Grand Army left Constantinople, the heavens opened. What should have been a triumphant march through the Balkans descended into a miserable, slogging ordeal. The dirt roads of the era, unprepared for such a host even in the best of times, dissolved into impassable quagmires. The great Danube River, the army's main artery for supply, swelled its banks, flooding the plains and turning them into vast, shallow lakes. Supply wagons sank up to their axles. The thousands of camels, animals of the arid steppe, sickened and died in the relentless damp and cold, their carcasses left to rot in the mud. Morale, once sky-high, began to seep away with every miserable, waterlogged step. The greatest victims of the deluge were the very instruments of Suleiman's power, the heavy siege cannons. These behemoths of bronze and iron, the pride of the imperial foundry, became impossible burdens. The teams of oxen strained, slipped, and fell, unable to drag the immense weight through the sucking mire. One by one, the largest and most crucial pieces of artillery had to be abandoned, surrendered not to an enemy army, but to the earth itself. The campaign fell catastrophically behind schedule. A journey that should have taken weeks stretched into months. Sickness began to spread through the waterlogged camps, dysentery, fever, and rot. The invincible army, the apocalyptic host, was being bled of its strength, its momentum, and its spirit, long before it ever saw the enemy. This was a new kind of foe, one that could not be fought with scimitars or muskets. It was a silent, indifferent war against the elements, and it was a war Suleiman was losing. On the 27th of September, the vanguard of the Ottoman army finally emerged from the rain-soaked forests and appeared before the walls of Vienna. The Lion of the East had arrived at the gates of the West. But this was not the triumphant, invincible conqueror that Europe had feared. This was a weary, bedraggled lion. Suleiman's grand army was a shadow of the force that had departed Constantinople 5 months earlier. They were exhausted from the grueling march, their numbers thinned by sickness, and critically they were without their heavy siege artillery. The very tools needed to smash the walls of a fortified city were lying buried in the mud hundreds of miles away. Looking out from the city ramparts, the defenders saw not an apocalyptic host, but a mortal army, tired and frustrated. The Viennese garrison was a patchwork force, vastly outnumbered. It comprised German Landsknecht mercenaries, Spanish musketeers sent by Charles V, and the local citizen militia, all under the command of the 70-year-old veteran Niklas Graf Salm. Their fortifications were medieval, hastily improved with earthen mounds to absorb the shock of cannon fire, but they were no match for what the full Ottoman siege train could have delivered. Yet the defenders possessed something the attackers were beginning to lose: resolve. They were fighting for their homes, their faith, and their lives. The choice was simple: victory or annihilation. For the Ottomans, the psychological blow of their journey was immense. They had expected a swift march and a glorious victory. Instead, they had fought a losing battle against nature itself. Now, they faced a defiant city, shrouded in autumn mist, with the bitter cold of winter fast approaching. The Sultan, a man accustomed to nothing but victory, gazed upon the walls of his red apple. The prize was within his grasp, yet the strength to seize it was already ebbing away. The stage was set for a desperate clash of empires, a contest not of pure strength, but of endurance and will. The autumn of 1529 fell upon Vienna not with the gentle gold of harvest, but with the cold, iron shadow of an empire. From the spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral, the citizens watched the horizon dissolve into a living sea of men and horses. This was not an army, it was a migration of conquest, a force of nature unleashed by the will of one man, Suleiman the Magnificent. 120,000 warriors, the finest of the Ottoman Empire, had arrived at the gates of a city defended by a mere 20,000. Inside the walls, fear was a physical presence. It was the taste of ash in the air, the frantic hammering of carpenters reinforcing the ancient stone, the hollow echo in the empty streets as citizens scurried to their tasks, their faces pale masks of dread. They were a motley collection: battle-hardened German Landsknechte mercenaries, stoic Spanish arquebusiers, and a terrified but resolute city militia. At their head stood a man of 70, Nicholas Graf Salm, a veteran whose body was a roadmap of past wars. He knew this was not just another battle, it was a last stand. Vienna was not merely a city, it was the psychological barrier of Christendom. If it fell, the road to the heart of Europe lay open. The defenders looked out from their ramparts at the endless city of silk tents that had sprouted overnight, at the horsetail standards fluttering in the wind. And then came the sound, the deep, rhythmic, unending beat of the Ottoman war drums, a sound designed to break the spirit before the first arrow was loosed. It was the heartbeat of a waiting predator, a promise of the violence to come. Every man, woman, and child within those walls understood the stakes. They were trapped, outnumbered, and facing the most powerful monarch on earth. Their only allies were their aging walls, their desperate courage, and the dawning realization that to surrender was to be erased. The storm broke on September 27th. The Ottoman cannons, though not the gargantuan siege guns Suleiman had been forced to abandon in the Hungarian mud, began their chorus of destruction. Stone chips flew from the medieval walls like deadly shrapnel, and the air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Yet the Viennese defenses, earthen ramparts hastily erected behind the stone, absorbed much of the punishment. The great walls did not crumble as the Sultan had anticipated. This was the first miscalculation, the first seed of doubt. Frustrated by the slow progress, Suleiman ordered his elite troops forward. The target was the Corinthian Gate, a key defensive point. Waves of Akinci light cavalry and infantry charged across the cleared ground, their war cries a chilling symphony against the crackle of arquebus fire from the ramparts. The defenders, led by the grizzled Nicholas Salm, held their ground with a ferocity born of desperation. Spanish marksmen, calm and methodical, picked off Ottoman officers. The German Landsknechte, with their fearsome Zweihänder greatswords, met the attackers in the breach, a whirlwind of steel and guttural screams. The initial Ottoman assault, meant to be a swift, terrifying display of power, faltered. It broke against a wall not just of stone, but of sheer will. As the Ottomans retreated, leaving heaps of their dead strewn before the gate, a cautious cheer rose from the defenders. It was a small victory in what would be a long and brutal struggle, but its psychological impact was immense. For the first time, they had faced the invincible army of the Sultan and thrown it back. They had seen the armor of the Ottoman giant, and now they had made the first crack. Suleiman watched from his magnificent tent, his brow furrowed. The city was proving to be a far tougher nut to crack than he had ever imagined. While the Viennese defenders found a flicker of hope in their defiance, A slow poison was seeping through the Ottoman camp. The magnificent city of tents, a symbol of imperial power, was becoming a mire of misery. The unusually harsh autumn rains never ceased, turning the ground into a vast, sucking swamp. Trenches filled with foul water and the fine silk pavilions of pashas sagged under the weight of the endless downpour. The very land seemed to be fighting against the invaders. With the mud came disease. Dysentery, the scourge of armies, spread like wildfire, weakening even the strongest warriors. The supply lines, already stretched to their breaking point over the long march from Constantinople, began to fail. Forage for the thousands of horses and camels became impossible to find in the sodden, stripped landscape. Food for the men grew scarce, but the most dangerous decay was not in the body, but in the spirit. The Janissaries, the Sultan's elite slave soldiers and the bedrock of his military might, were growing mutinous. They were warriors of the grand charge, of swift, decisive battles that ended in glorious plunder. This was different. This was a slow, miserable death in the mud, fighting for every inch of ground against a cornered and surprisingly ferocious enemy. They grumbled in their tents, their resentment simmering. Where were the great cannons? Why had the Sultan brought them to this god-forsaken, rain-lashed land so late in the season? Whispers turned to open dissent. Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Vizier and Suleiman's most trusted friend, rode through the camp, his presence a threat and a promise, but even he could not fully quell the rising tide of discontent. The Janissaries felt the first bite of winter in the air and knew that to be caught here when the snows fell would mean annihilation. The invincible army was rotting from within. With his artillery failing to breach the walls and his infantry being repulsed with heavy losses, Suleiman turned to the dark arts of siegecraft, the subterranean war. His army contained some of the most skilled military engineers in the world, particularly miners recruited from the silver mines of the Balkans. Their new battlefield was not the open field, but the cold, silent earth beneath Vienna. Day and night, these sappers began to dig, carving tunnels, or saps, towards the foundations of the city's walls. Their goal was to pack these tunnels with barrels of gunpowder and detonate them, creating catastrophic breaches that the Janissaries could pour through. For the defenders, this was a new and insidious terror. The enemy was no longer just at the gates, but potentially right under their feet. The silence of the night was broken by faint, rhythmic thuds, the sound of pickaxes biting into the earth deep below. It was the sound of approaching doom. To combat this unseen threat, the Viennese began their own desperate countermining operations. Basins of water and drums with peas scattered on top were placed in cellars along the walls, acting as primitive seismic detectors to pinpoint the direction of the Ottoman digging. Once a tunnel was located, the defenders would dig their own shaft to intercept it. What followed was a form of warfare unique in its horror. In narrow, suffocating tunnels, lit only by flickering lanterns, small groups of men would collide in a frenzy of close-quarters combat. Fights were waged with daggers, swords, and sharpened shovels in a darkness thick with the smell of damp earth and fear. A misplaced spark could detonate the gunpowder, entombing both sides. On several occasions, the defenders successfully broke into Ottoman tunnels, slaughtering the sappers and collapsing their work. This invisible, claustrophobic battle became as critical as the fighting on the ramparts. It was a grim, desperate struggle in the bowels of the earth, a hidden war to save the city above. For weeks, the fate of Vienna was being decided not by the clash of steel on the ramparts, but by the scrape of shovels in the dark, damp earth beneath. Ottoman sappers, masters of siegecraft, had been burrowing towards the city's foundations, creating a subterranean web of death. Their goal was the Kerntner Tor, the Corinthian Gate, a key bastion in the city's defense. In the Ottoman camp, a grim anticipation mounted. This would be the masterstroke, the blow that would shatter Vienna's stubborn will. Inside the walls, the defenders lived in a state of constant gnawing tension. They would press their ears to the ground, trying to discern the faint rhythmic scratching of their unseen enemies. Counterminers dug frantically, hoping to intercept the Ottoman tunnels in a desperate underground war of ambush and collapse. On October 11th, the moment arrived. A massive charge of gunpowder, placed with precision beneath the gate's bastion, was lit. The Ottomans braced for an apocalyptic roar, for a section of the wall to be lifted into the sky, leaving a gaping wound for the Janissaries to pour through. A tremor ran through the ground, followed by a deafening, concussive blast. Earth and stone erupted and a cloud of black smoke choked the air. But when the dust began to settle, the hearts of the Ottoman commanders sank. The explosion was immense, yet it was not decisive. It had not vaporized the wall. It had created a ragged, treacherous breach, a chaotic ramp of rubble and splintered timber some 80 feet wide. It was a wound, yes, but a cauterized one. The Viennese, under the command of the 70-year-old veteran Niklas Graf Salm, had anticipated this. They had already constructed a new, earthen rampart behind the weakened wall. The breach was not a gateway. It was a carefully prepared killing ground. The earth had rumbled, but it had not broken Vienna's back. For Suleiman, watching from his magnificent tent, this was more than a tactical setback. It was a challenge to the very notion of his destiny. His grandest weapon had been deployed, and it had proven insufficient. With the breach created, however imperfect, there could be no hesitation. The signal was given. From the Ottoman lines surged the empire's most fearsome weapon, the Janissaries. They were the Sultan's household troops, the slave soldiers raised from childhood for one purpose: to kill and die for the Padishah. They had broken the Hungarian knights at Mohacs, stormed the walls of Rhodes, and known nothing but victory under Suleiman. Dressed in their distinctive uniforms with their tall white felt hats, they advanced not with a wild cry but with a disciplined, terrifying resolve. They were the instrument of the Sultan's will, the hand that would finally grasp Vienna and crush it. But the breach was a funnel of death. As the first wave of Janissaries scrambled over the jagged rubble, the Viennese defenders unleashed a storm of lead and iron. From behind their hastily erected inner wall, German Landsknecht mercenaries, professional soldiers as hardened as the Janissaries themselves, met the charge with forests of long pikes. Arquebusiers fired point-blank into the densely packed ranks of the attackers. The fighting was brutal, intimate, and utterly without quarter. Men slipped on blood-slicked stones, stabbing and hacking in a desperate melee. For 3 hours the Janissaries threw themselves at the gap, wave after wave. They were driven by their legendary discipline and the promise of immense rewards from the Sultan himself. They clawed their way to the top of the rubble pile, only to be met by a wall of determined steel and a hail of gunfire that sent them tumbling back. The Sultan watched as his elite, his invincible soldiers were systematically slaughtered. The breach became a tomb. For the first time in their glorious history under Suleiman, the Janissaries' ferocity was not enough. Their grasp, which had seized half the world, could not find a firm hold on this one defiant city. The cost in blood was staggering, and for a gain measured in mere feet. As the sun began to set, a bitter realization dawned in the Ottoman command. The soul of their army was being broken against the stones of Vienna. The air in the Sultan's camp on the evening of October 13th was thick with failure and the biting cold of the coming winter. The grand assault had failed. The Janissaries were bloodied, exhausted, and their morale was dangerously low. Suleiman the Magnificent, the lawgiver, faced a crisis that could not be solved by decree. His commanders advised retreat. The season was too late, the army too weary, the city too defiant. But Suleiman's pride, the very foundation of his authority, would not permit such an ignominious end. On the morning of October 14th, he convened a council of war. He did not ask for opinions. He gave an order. There would be one final, all-out assault. He promised his Janissaries promotions, lavish bonuses, and the glory of plundering one of Christendom's great capitals. He sought to reignite the fire that had conquered kingdoms. But the promises rang hollow. The Janissaries, who had seen their comrades dismembered in the breach, heard only the promise of a futile death. Whispers of dissent, a thing almost unheard of in the Sultan's presence, rippled through the ranks. Some accounts say they initially refused the order, only to be driven forward by the whips and swords of their agas. When the final assault began, it lacked the thunderous conviction of the previous attempts. It was a weary, reluctant tide of men pushed towards a shore that had already broken them. They advanced under a sky the color of lead, their movements sluggish. The Viennese defenders, their spirits now soaring, met this final push with renewed vigor. They had survived the worst the Sultan could throw at them. They could feel the enemy's will faltering. The attack sputtered and died amidst the rubble of the breach, a final, desperate gasp rather than a roar. It was over. Suleiman, from his vantage point, saw not a battle being lost, but a reality being forged. His will was not absolute. His army was not invincible. The aura of destiny that had surrounded him since his ascension to the throne had just been pierced. The silence that followed the failed assault was more damning than the roar of any cannon. The decision was made in the cold silence of the Sultan's tent on the night of October 14th. There would be no more assaults. The siege of Vienna was over. The retreat began before dawn, a stealthy, shame-faced withdrawal. Under the cover of darkness, the vast Ottoman army began to dissolve. Orders were given to muffle the sounds of departure. To deny the enemy any trophies, great piles of baggage and supplies were set ablaze, casting an eerie, flickering glow against the low clouds. A final, cruel act marked their departure, the massacre of thousands of Christian prisoners, civilians captured in the Austrian countryside, who they could neither feed nor drag along on the arduous journey home. This was not the triumphant march of a conquering hero. It was the quiet, bitter exit of a monarch who had met his match. For Suleiman, this was a profound psychological reckoning. He was the shadow of God on earth, a title that implied a divine mandate for victory. He could not simply admit defeat. The official narrative was already being crafted. This was never a conquest, but merely a punitive expedition to chastise Ferdinand. The Sultan had appeared, punished his foe, and was now returning to his capital. But he knew the truth. As the first snowflakes of an early, vicious winter began to fall, the retreat turned into an ordeal. The heavy cannons which had failed to break Vienna's walls now became anchors of misery, sinking into the deepening mud. Men and camels, already weakened by the campaign, perished from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. The long road back to Constantinople was a funeral march for the myth of Suleiman's invincibility. When the sun rose over Vienna, the defenders stared in disbelief from the ramparts. The vast, city-like encampment of the Ottomans was gone. All that remained were smoldering fires, abandoned trenches, and the profound silence of victory. They had survived. For Suleiman, however, that silence was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of a limit, a border he could not cross, a testament to the one city that had refused to bow. The retreat from Vienna was not a rout. It was an agonizing, bleeding withdrawal. The legendary Ottoman army, which had marched under the golden sun of conquest, now trudged back through a sea of mud and chilling autumn rain. Every league covered was a fresh humiliation, every abandoned cannon a silent testament to failure. Yet, upon reaching Constantinople, a different story had to be told. An empire built on the myth of divine favor and unstoppable momentum could not afford the truth. Suleiman, the lawgiver, the Magnificent, could not have been defeated by a mere city garrison. And so, reality was remade by imperial decree. The grand procession into the capital was a masterpiece of political theater. Banners flew, trumpets blared, and the people cheered a fabricated triumph. The official narrative was that the Sultan had magnanimously decided not to take the city. his objective having been merely to chastise the upstart Archduke Ferdinand. Captives, mostly unfortunate Hungarian nobles and peasants swept up in the campaign, were paraded as trophies. Suleiman even held a grand court ceremony where he received tribute from the King of Vienna, a fiction designed to cement the illusion of victory. But behind the silk curtains of Topkapi Palace, the truth festered. The whispers among the viziers and agas were not of victory, but of survival. They had seen the empty ammunition carts, the frostbitten faces of the janissaries, and the haunted look in the eyes of their sultan. They knew the campaign had been a colossal gamble that had failed. The grand spectacle in the hippodrome was for the masses, a gilded mask to hide the deep, unsettling wound of a campaign that had reached too far. For the first time, the shadow of a limit had fallen across the endless ambition of the House of Osman. An empire's greatest weapon is not its cavalry or its cannons, but its reputation. Before 1529, the Ottoman Empire's reputation was one of divine, terrifying inevitability. Rhodes had fallen. Belgrade had fallen. Mohacs had been a slaughter. The armies of the Sultan were seen as a force of nature, a tide that could not be turned. Vienna changed that forever. The physical losses were significant. Tens of thousands of men, irreplaceable siege guns, and countless pack animals. But the psychological damage was far more profound. This was a scar not on the body of the empire, but on its very soul. For the elite janissaries, the shock was acute. They were the Sultan's lions, the undefeated heart of the army. Yet they had been held at bay by a motley collection of German Landsknechte and Spanish arquebusiers, fighting from behind hastily repaired earthen walls. Their assaults were broken, their mining tunnels discovered, their aura of invincibility shattered against Viennese grit. This failure planted a seed of doubt that would grow into future mutinies and discontent. Militarily, the lessons were brutal. The Ottoman war machine, so perfectly adapted to the plains of Anatolia and the Balkans, had met its logistical breaking point. The long, vulnerable supply lines, the reliance on fair weather, and the sheer time it took to move a massive army from Istanbul to Central Europe were exposed as critical weaknesses. The campaign revealed that the empire had an operational radius, a point beyond which its power diminished with every muddy mile. Europe's monarchs, who had once trembled at the mention of the Sultan's name, now saw a blueprint for resistance. They had learned that the Ottoman juggernaut could be stopped, not just by a great army in the field, but by defiance, weather, and the tyranny of distance. The scar of Vienna was a constant reminder that the empire, for all its magnificence, was mortal. While Suleiman was manufacturing a victory in Constantinople, a very different mood was sweeping through the courts of Christian Europe. For Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and his brother Ferdinand I, the news from Vienna was nothing short of a miracle. The city, the bulwark of their eastern domains, had held. The tide had not just been stopped, it had been turned back. This was more than a military victory. It was a profound ideological and propaganda coup. The successful defense transformed Vienna from a vulnerable frontier outpost into a heroic symbol of Christian resilience. Ferdinand, once seen as a beleaguered archduke clinging to a contested kingdom, was now lauded as the savior of Christendom. The 700 Spanish arquebusiers who had been so critical in the defense became legends, their firearms a testament to new European military technology. The victory sent a shockwave of relief and newfound confidence across the German states and beyond. For Suleiman, this was the dawn of a new and persistent nightmare. He had intended to crush Ferdinand and remove the Habsburgs as a thorn in his side once and for all. Instead, his failure had emboldened them. He had inadvertently solidified their authority and given them a rallying cry that could unite the perpetually fractured princes of the Holy Roman Empire against him. The Sultan's strategic calculus had to change. Before 1529, his European strategy was one of relentless offense. After Vienna, he was forced into a more reactive posture. He now faced an enemy who knew he could be beaten, an enemy whose key bastion had proven its strength. Every future campaign in the West would be shadowed by the memory of this failure, forcing him to commit even more resources, to plan even more meticulously, for an enemy who no longer saw him as invincible. The Habsburgs were no longer just a nuisance. They were a permanent, defiant rival on his western border, a wall against which his ambitions would repeatedly break. History is not merely a record of battles won and lost. It is a study of tides, of the great flows of power as they expand and inevitably recede. The 1529 siege of Vienna was more than a defeat for Suleiman. It was the moment the Ottoman tide reached its high-water mark in Central Europe. It was the moment the empire discovered its own physical limits. The true victors at Vienna were not necessarily the city's defenders, heroic as they were. The true victors were logistics, geography, and climate. The Ottoman state was a magnificent instrument of conquest, but it was an instrument tuned for a specific environment. The campaign calendar was dictated by the seasons. The army had to leave Constantinople in the spring, after the winter muds had dried, and had to be on its way home by late autumn, before the next winter snows made the Balkan passes impassable. This gave them only a narrow window for major siege operations so deep in enemy territory. Vienna lay at the absolute extremity of this operational range. Every loaf of bread, every barrel of gunpowder, every cannonball had to be hauled over 1,000 miles. This gargantuan effort was brought to its knees by something infuriatingly simple: rain. The unseasonably early and heavy autumn rains of 1529 turned the roads into quagmires, bogged down the heavy siege artillery, and spread sickness through the Ottoman camp. Suleiman had conquered kings and crushed crusader armies, but he could not conquer the mud of Austria. This campaign was a brutal lesson in imperial overstretch. It demonstrated that an empire's borders are not always defined by armies and treaties, but by the more fundamental constraints of time and distance. While the Ottoman Empire would remain a formidable power for centuries, and Suleiman would return to ravage the Austrian countryside, the dream of planting the crescent flag on the cathedrals of Germany was over. Vienna was the invisible wall, the point on the map where the magnificent, terrifying power of the Sultan simply ran out of reach.